and welcome to the Future Leaders Youth Forum, a conversation with Dr. Hyginus Leon, President of the Caribbean Development Bank. I am Raisa Joseph and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Today's engagement forms part of a wider continued process that the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College has started to center the importance of education and development. We are indeed elated to have Dr. Leo with us for a variety of reasons. Firstly, Dr. Leo was our featured speaker at the inaugural Unthink Thought Festival earlier this year, which marked the 30th anniversary of the passing of Sir William Arthur Lewis. Additionally, we wish to celebrate Dr. Leo's great accomplishment of ascending to the post of President of the Caribbean Development Bank, the second St. Lucian to achieve such a feat. The first was Sir William Arthur Lewis. Today's engagement will feature alumni, brilliant individuals who will engage Dr. Leo in conversation on a range of issues and topics. But before we begin our conversation, we wish to welcome our principal of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, Dr. Keith Nurse, who will give us some brief remarks.
Thank you very much, Raisa. Pleasure to all the panelists. Welcome to St. Lucia and to the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, Dr. Leon. It's a distinct pleasure to have you as one of our guests for this youth forum. As you would recall, when we hosted the Unthink Festival, we organized a panel on youth entrepreneurship and so forth. We are a firm believer that the future is defined by the youth, and that's why we've organized this particular session, where we would allow our young alumni to engage with someone like yourself, who's also an alumni from the college. I'm sure a lot has changed since your time, but it's a real pleasure to have you on the campus and for us to share with you some thoughts and ideas about the future of Caribbean development, but also the wider issues of global transformation. So, Raisa, back over to you. And again, thanks again, Dr. Leon, for coming to the campus and sharing your time with us. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nurse, for these remarks, and welcome again, Dr. Leo. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Before we go into the really engaging discussions on development and education, it's interesting to find out a little bit more about yourself. Very often persons look at individuals who have achieved great feats, as you would have, not just ascending to the post of President of the Caribbean Development Bank, but having worked in a series of reputable organizations like the IMF. But I wanted to know from you what the impact of education locally, particularly in St. Lucia and the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, has played in shaping who you are today.
It's an interesting point. Sir Arthur Lewis Community College itself was a very small part of that education that you speak to. And I say a small part because the college came into existence or had its first cohort of students in the fall or the beginning of the academic year 1974-75. And myself and Didicus, the Director General who just left, were the first batch of students that came to Sir Arthur, but we migrated from St. Mary's College. So in fact, we had done the first year of lower six, if we can, I don't know what the terminology is now, but we did the lower six year at SMC and came to A-level college for the second year. So I only did 1 year at A-level college, as it was called then. And so we were the first graduating class, 1975, of the A-level college, even if we only had done 1 year in the college. And that's because of the cessation of the sixth form at St. Mary's. And we were the in-between year, and so we had the second year here and the first year at St. Mary's. And so from that perspective, when I say it was a small part, it's not to diminish the contribution it did in the educational development, but it's just that I would equally argue St. Mary's lays claim to at least for fifth form and first year lower six, and the Vieux Secondary School, which is where I came from before I went to St. Mary's. Equally, I could claim my first 4 secondary school years was at VFSS. And so in principle, the 7 years we are talking about, 1 was here, 2 at St. Mary's, and 4 at Vieux Secondary School. So I'd want to be able to give credit to all 3 institutions in terms of that first phase of my education. From there, I went to London to study. Did a London stroke University of Southampton stint. Then I finished my formal education. And then I stayed, I worked as a lecturer at the University of Kent, in Canterbury. And while I was at lecturing at Kent, I decided to come to the Caribbean Development Bank. So I did a couple of years at the CDB. And from the CDB, I went to the Central Bank of Barbados as the Director of Research. And all of those, even if they are not in the sense of certification granting education, I see those as part of your wider education, because that's how you build and have the character that we're talking about. And when I left the Central Bank, I went into academia, or back to academia. I went to State University of New York and did 6 years there. And while I was on my sabbatical year, I decided through invitation I was going to do a 1-year stint sabbatical at the IMF. I went, did the 1 year, got excited, stayed, and the rest was history. I did almost 25 years at the IMF, and now I'm back in Barbados at the CDB. So that's the entire tour. I think it's probably fair to say that my headspace, how I see the world, which I want to call my education, is clearly a mix of all of the experiences, lessons one learning across all of those institutions over those last however many years, from 75 through now. That's, I take it 46 years or thereabouts, yes.
That is quite a phenomenal journey, particularly your foundation and the fact that you speak to character being shaped throughout those years. And I highlighted your start because very often, particularly for youth, since it's a youth forum, we see persons recognize success, and it's important to understand that it's a pathway. I too am from the Before Comprehensive Secondary School, so I'm happy that you highlighted that as well, coming from your background, and we celebrate all your achievements today. Now, I would like to hand over to Ms. Tiana Foster, who is the 2017 Sir Arthur Lewis Community College valedictorian, who will also be engaging as part of our panel today.
Sure.
Tiana, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Raisa. As Raisa said, my name is Tiana Foster, and I graduated from the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College in 2017.
Yes.
I then went on to the University of Bristol in the UK, where I studied law. I then completed the Bar Professional Training course, which I completed in May of this year. I was called to the Bar of England and Wales in July of this year, and I will be called to the Bar of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court in St. Lucia in about 2 weeks, after which I will begin practicing law in St. Lucia.
Yeah.
My first question for you this morning is, what, in your opinion, are the challenges and opportunities facing Caribbean states today? So it's a two-part question. Firstly, what are the challenges that we face? And secondly, what are the opportunities?
The challenges, I think, I would say 3. One, the legacy, I call it a legacy challenge of the structural weaknesses that we have faced as a people, economic and social and political, that we, as of 2019, had not yet overcome. So that's one. Let's slice it here. The second challenge is a current challenge, which is the COVID challenge. how do we see COVID? What's the impact of COVID? And more importantly, distinguishing not the current effect of COVID, but the longer term effect of COVID. And to be equally fair, I don't think we have been talking about that. We are frozen on being able to get ourselves first handling the concept of COVID and what it means to our lives, that we have not yet stopped to think about the longer term. And I think the longer term is a challenge, not only because we don't know what has happened, but because I think COVID has some way to go. And because it has some way to go, the magnitude of that future that I'm talking about is probably many times more than what we understand it today. That'd be the second challenge. The third challenge is a future challenge, and that's, I think, squarely in the environmental sustainability aspects. Let's just call it climate change for now, because we, as the region, I think we are likely to have the most damaging longer-term impact of climate change on the way we live. And that impact is more so and pressing to me because what we do know is that even if we fixed the climate change issue today, even if we fixed it today, meaning we stopped emissions, the accumulated impact of where we are as of today is such that it is already done significant damage to our countries, our biodiversity, and so on, that we have already, in a sense, lost half of the battle on climate change. Now, to the extent that we need to extend this to the time at which it will be effected, it means then the duration required to make a decision on climate change and to implement it. That additional burden almost certainly means that things are going to be much, much worse than where we would be if we even froze it today. So I think those three challenges are, in a sense, a perfect storm: a legacy, a current, and a future that need to be addressed, and addressed in an integrated way, because you cannot separate them. And if there is one big problem now in terms of assessing challenges, is we are still looking at them as three separate issues. And the three things flow into each other because policy to react to them has to be integrated. And so that's the opportunity. At the same time, if you know the challenge, then you know the opportunity. Is can we pivot a set of policies that can A, handle the rescue operation of the current, take care of rebalancing the legacy issues that we spoke of, because clearly the fact that it's a legacy means there's a tension that is not yet evened out, and at the same time repositioning the current rescue and the rebalancing of the legacy to the forward-looking component of where we would like to be. Imagining, as it were, what a future Caribbean or world should look like, and creating these policies now that will get us there, but get us there while we are addressing the two dimensions we spoke of the current and the legacy issues. So these would be my capsulated high-level three issues that I would say were greatest challenges and opportunities.
Thank you.
I think Tiana has given us the perfect question to really anchor a discussion.
Yeah.
And the three areas that you have highlighted, I'm going to come back to them a bit later when we speak about the legacy and perhaps the lessons that we can pull from them, as well as looking at the COVID challenge, not just as a separate health issue that deals just with COVID, but other factors as well. Mm-hmm. But I want to now carry over to our virtual panelists who are also joining in with us, and go to another brilliant individual by the name of Yenva Caesar. He is one of St. Lucia's Chevening Scholars for this year, who will pose his question and introduce himself. Welcome, Yenva.
Thank you, Raisa, for the introduction. Good day, Dr. Leo.
How are you?
My name is Yen Caesar.
Very good.
I am currently a Foreign Service Officer. I graduated from the college in 2013. I served as the President of the Students' Council during my time there. I then went to the University of the West Indies, where I graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in International Relations, as well as a Master's of Science in Tourism Development and Management. I left as the Faculty of Social Sciences valedictorian in 2017. I will be heading to the London School of Economics and Political Science in a few weeks or possibly days to pursue a Master's of Science in Development Studies through Shielding Scholarship. My question today, again, going from the start which Tiana has given us, when I think of Caribbean Development Bank, I think of development and I think of the many strands of development there are, whether it is economic, sustainable, otherwise. And then when I think of bank, in the traditional sense at least, I think of profit generation. Bearing that in mind, my question is, what is the Caribbean Development Bank doing to perceive the nexus between development and bank to address some of the challenges which you would have just explained to Tiana, and likewise to capitalize on the opportunities that would arise?
Is that the title, Caribbean Development Bank, in essence is a three-part title. There's the Caribbean part, there's the development part, and there's the banking part. In fact, when I joined the bank in May, that's the first thing I said to staff is, it's not by accident that we have three parts to the title. Now, it may not have been designed that way, but there are three parts. And you are perfectly right. There's a development role, which is captured in the mandate of the bank, which is to create opportunities for the harmonious economic development of the member states. In particular, at that point in 1969, it was written as with special emphasis to the less developed members. That essentially meant the OECS. So that development aspect was there. And I think broadly people interpreted that development as economic development. Maybe with some social development, because we tended to focus over the first 50 years on education, maybe a little on the health side, looking at communities, sustainable development elements. But that was broadly economic development in the large. Helping governments implement projects and so on was also there. The banking part was equally there, but it was captured by maybe a famous phrase that Sir Arthur Lewis said in one of his opening remarks in 1970 or 71, that I can only be a bank if I can borrow. Meaning, he can only be a bank if he can borrow funds to be able to lend funds. And so he was making the point at the time that the 70, I think, million or $50 million that was used to raise the bank in the first place was not adequate, because within the first year or two of starting to disburse funds, they had already run out of money. And so he was saying, I need to be able to borrow so I can actually lend, and so I need to be a bank. And therefore, I have to be able to safeguard those resources. So when you say for profit, safeguard resources to be able to generate a return, but not necessarily the same profit as per a commercial bank would be making. And the third element, the Caribbean part, for me now is when we say the one word, harmonious development, tells me now that we are looking at an integrated space, not individual countries, else there'd be no need for harmony. It's already there. What I have tried to do is to rethink this a little in the following sense. I think we need to identify that each of the parts of the name cannot be equally applicable at all points in time, but that it should be specific to the need of the time. And so there may be, and it may not have been so in the history of the bank, but there may be times when the Caribbean harmonious integrated element should dominate, not be the only thing, but should dominate. In as much as sometimes maybe the bank part should dominate, and other times when maybe the development part should dominate. Bearing in mind that I am a bank, so I need to have generation of resources to help keep me afloat, or my shareholders need to, in a sense, give me the means to be able to stay alive, and I need to always be serving the region. I cannot serve one country. But I think for me in this period, this era, my first term, I would say unabashedly that I think development to me has to rise as the most pressing element of the three-part title that makes up the bank. And why do I say that? I say that because of where we started with Tiana. The confluence, the perfect storm of events that are facing us now, I think dictates that we have no option, no choice, but to see the development of the region within a reasonable time frame as being almost an existential issue. And I think it would be remiss, even irresponsible is too strong a word, but not appropriate for the bank to say its banking function should trounce the development function at this point in time, because you need that development to be able to perpetuate the generation of income that could support the banking aspects that we are talking about. Now that has other implications in terms of sourcing of funding, cost of disbursement of funding, but we can leave that to a second level if we wish as we go down. But I would pivot that to say, yes, development for me is above. There is always going to be attention because you are a bank and you are charged with development, but you cannot see them as equal. And I think the leadership of the bank at every 5-year stint should, in my mind, be deciding, given the confluence of events, given where we want to go, which of those will dominate. And as I said, for me, the dominating factor over the next 5 years has to be development.
Thank you so much for that response and the answer to that question.
Yeah.
I think your response is in keeping with the global movement to recognize that regional development has regressed since the pandemic has really hit not just small island developing states, but the globe in general. And I think a point that you would have highlighted is strategic awareness of how you position and what resources you actually use. And I think it allows me to segue perfectly to our next panelist in terms of the need of our time and the need for advocacy. We have the person of Mr. Murphylus James, who I am pleased to introduce, who has advocated on many respects for the inclusion of persons of and for disabilities in St. Lucia. Welcome, Murphylus.
Thank you very much, Raisa. Dr. Leon, Dr. Nurse, ladies, gentlemen, my colleagues on the panel, good morning.
Thanks.
It is so thrilling to have been invited to this distinguished forum as a disability rights advocate. I graduated from the college in 2005, and the extremely supportive, motivating environment created by my peers and the lecturers undoubtedly contributed to me as a person with physical disability myself having a very successful time and graduating valedictorian during my time. Dr. Leon, when compared to people without disabilities, the sector that I represent has been flagged by the World Health Organization as experiencing lower education achievements and facing the highest rates of discrimination, unemployment, and poverty. With this interesting word poverty, we all here know too well what the fundamental cure for poverty is. Now, when knowledge translates into formal education and certification, marketable skills, it equips people especially people with disabilities, with the tools needed to break that cycle of poverty, and it increases the chances of upward mobility. Following the great contributions of my colleagues, I wish to pose the question: what role do you, Dr. Leon, see the CDB playing in enabling tertiary level institutions such as the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College to make education even more accessible and affordable to all eligible students, especially those facing financial hardships?
Thank you, Maphilus. I want to preface this. You've asked what role the CDB can do. I think I want to preface this with a segue. I think it is bigger than the CDB. I have elevated it to a regional transformation of a development agenda. And let me just back up a little here. First, when we say development, I want us to be very clear. Development for me is a holistic concept. It is not a slice. It's a holistic concept. And so I talk always in terms of the development ecosystem. What I really mean by this when I say it's a holistic concept is we can only achieve true development if no element of the development ecosystem is left behind. And let me just indicate where my philosophical underpinnings is coming from. The climate crisis we are facing now is exactly because we didn't treat activity on Earth as an ecosystem. We went ahead in one direction and forgot that there was an implication for Mother Earth, right? And now we are playing catch up by trying to redress, rebalance that ecosystem. Now, let's step back to where we were. When I said development is an ecosystem, and one which you cannot leave any part behind, it tells me that the social aspects of that ecosystem, the institutional aspects of that ecosystem, the mental, psychical, cultural aspects of that ecosystem, the economic aspects of that ecosystem, the environmental aspects of that ecosystem, all have to be integrated in such a way that they are harmonized, so that when you advance, the ecosystem can advance. If that does not occur, then one part is lagging, and therefore the whole cannot go smoothly. A tension arises from that which is left behind. And where does that link to what you were saying? As you prefaced your remarks of disabilities or people with disadvantages as being discriminated against. That is one of the tensions I am referring to the extent that you have a part of an ecosystem, and there are many disabled of different degrees in a society. If you were to leave them behind by choice or by design, it's quite clear. The totality of that human side cannot advance as it would have advanced if all was brought forward. So the first principle has to be one of empowerment and equity, to recognize universality of that concept of an ecosystem. So that's the first point. The second is you link this to knowledge. I believe all activity boils down to one thing: knowledge. So much so that in my 2013, maybe was that, you had already graduated. I gave an independence lecture here in 2013. And one of the points I was making was, if we think of the standard output is a function of capital and labor and energy and know-how. Let's just say these are your basic elements. And you ask yourself, what is capital? Capital is embodied knowledge. What is labor? I think we'll all agree labor is embodied knowledge because we go to school, we get skills. What is energy? Energy is equally embodied knowledge, whether it is knowledge to extract, knowledge to transform, it is knowledge. And know-how by definition is knowledge. So in principle, we can say output is simply a function of knowledge. Now, if it is a function of knowledge, then the question really should be, how does that knowledge generation process actually work? And I say knowledge generation process as opposed to knowledge. It's a sequence that starts with the accumulation of knowledge, which is what we would be learning at school, the transforming of that knowledge warehouse by culling success factors, areas where we have issues, challenges, and so on, and classifying those now as diagnostics of a knowledge accumulation process. And then the third aspect now is to transform those factors that we have actually talked about and create now strategies to effect and, I would even work the word, weaponize knowledge. Once you see that process in its totality, then you come to an understanding that everything that we have, every place we are going to go, the future of humanity is founded on that one principle of knowledge transformation. From accumulation to diagnosis to strategy creation. Now, if we recognize that, then it becomes almost axiomatic that any endeavor that is focused on development of the people, of the country, of the nation, of the region, the world, has to be founded on an appreciation of and an embracing of all that goes on with this knowledge generation process. And so for me, I don't have to argue, are there merits to finding ways of providing education for any and every person in a society. It is the sine qua non of our existence. The only thing I would want to say is we need acceptance of that first point. If we have acceptance, and we have the acceptance of the first part, where I said don't leave any part behind because it's an ecosystem, then you are led inescapably to the one conclusion that a foremost central aspect of any development thrust has to be on ensuring that every human, and maybe some animals as well, every human should have not just the ability, but I would even argue the right to be exposed and to be tutored in the means to advance that knowledge generation process. And hence why at CDB, one of the pillars that I have indicated I would like to champion, at least going forward, is the pillar of education in building social resilience. And education there, in my mind, is not only education at the tertiary level. It is from the beginning, if you want, after you're born, all the way to the grave. Because we are always learning, but with one difference I'd like to see, and that's me thinking. I'm not saying this is where we are or where we should be, but that's me thinking. To the extent that that knowledge generating process is one that is the foundation of all innovation. And because innovation is the only constant that has led to an advancement of humanity, then I think our entire learning process should be one that is focused on building innovation through learning, focusing on inquiry, discovery, and problem solving. And that calls for another whole discussion on how we do this in a learning context where our schools embrace a different mode of pedagogy and content in terms of generating the type of learning principles we are talking about.
It's raised, and it's connected to previous questions posed by Tiana earlier on, and I want to draw a connection between your emphasis on knowledge creation and in particular literacy to speak about the legacy that you highlighted in your first question's response. When we look at not just Caribbean governments but societies, do you believe that there is an adequate awareness of our legacy and the challenges to be able to address them and put the resources necessary to addressing them? And in addition to that, since we spoke about partnership, what levels of engagements are not necessary, not just within schools or within the bank, but in terms of civil society organizations and communities, to not just invest in education, but to have that kind of cultural awareness that education is that driving force that is now going to facilitate transformation?
Yeah, I think people in general, policymakers, are aware of the legacy issues. Our academics have been equally vocal in talking about those legacy issues. What is missing is a forum to prioritize which of the legacy issues are the most urgent. And that is because you have a constraint. Everything we do requires finance. That's the nature of our societies. And therefore, you haven't got unlimited resources. But you have to be able to prioritize the topics that in those legacy problems you think is the most important, most urgent for today. I would have put education, learning in that space, not because it is so urgent that people are going to die tomorrow, but because it is the foundation of our future. That's why I would rank it up there. Partnership-wise, my sense is we equally have an inadequate sense of what partnership means. There's a cultural dimension to that, whereby our mindset is a mindset of firefighting, a mindset of fixing things, rather than a mindset of creating things. When you're in a mindset of creating, you get into a mindset of planning. And when you get in a mindset of planning, it tells you need to avoid contradicting or opposing aspects. And what that tells you is there is no need for, and it's not productive to be competing. What you need is more collaboration, because competing is naturally knocking against each other and creating friction. Collaborating allows you to amass envelope and to grow together. And so partnerships for me now is about all stakeholders being able to see common goals, that when independently units work through collaboration, those goals can be achieved. So it's a whole purpose-driven approach to how society should operate than the more competitive, clashing, tension-driven firefighting modes that we actually operate in. And so that would be the way I would see partnerships as evolving.
Thank you so much. Tiana, I hand over to you to ask Dr. Leo any other question you think is pertinent at this time.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Leo. So in response to my first question, you highlighted one of our current challenges as being the current COVID-19 pandemic. And you also stated that it is your belief that the future impact has not yet been appreciated. Can you give us a little more insight as to your opinion as to what you think that future impact is and how we as individuals can prepare for that?
Maybe two dimensions. Let's even take what we know now. What is measured is a good sense of what we know. What we typically do, at least in the economics fraternity, is we say, well, COVID occurred, massive crisis, St. Lucia, let's stay there, dropped 20% in real GDP growth in 2020. Now, our minds, we are saying, well, COVID, when it disappears, we can get back to where we were in X number of years. And to get a quick example, a 20% drop now will require 25% growth to get back to where we were. Now, you tell me, if you studied this, what's the average growth rate in St. Lucia? 3, 4, 5? Now, if you just start with 3, you add 4, you go to 6. Even if you go to 7, you probably need another 8 before you can even make up just that 1 year's crash deficit. But if you measure it by that sense, the impact of COVID is just those 5 years. But what we also know from COVID is, gender-wise, women, females in general, have borne a more or a disproportionate impact of COVID. Whether it is because of inability to work because they have to stay home, or because they typically save less, or because they have to transform what they are doing for other duties. But women have borne a bigger problem, so the gender disparity issue is there. What we also know from research and evidence is the quicker you advance gender inequities, the more potential you have for actually growing. So we can think that's another bucket. Education. We have experienced now that COVID has lost an average of 6 to 18 months in learning opportunities for kids or people in the educational space. How do you make up for that? Is it going to be 18 months? Or is it going to be spread over the normal time? And what's the longer term impact of that education? We have poverty. Poverty has moved from 20 to about 40% in the region. How do you return from that 40% back to 20? How long will it take? At what cost? We have inequities in terms of inequality that has gotten worse. Now, these are not things we are integrating. And then there's the bigger one. Lockdown, closure in homes, families that have not been together altogether for more than X hours a day, because out to work, back, you sleep. But now they've been together for 1.5 years. Every day seeing each other, and I think you know where I'm going with this, whether it be tensions in the home, mental illness. That's another cost of COVID, just of COVID as of now. And I want you to multiply that. If COVID were to remain for another 2 years or become a permanent fixture, is it sufficient to be talking then about just a return to normal GDP levels? Shouldn't we be talking now of a broader development measure that says not just return of one measure, that's the salami slice issue, but now return to normalcy of all aspects of development? And when you magnify that and put it in that context, then I think the impact of COVID is far, far, far much more than I think we are internalizing now on the basis of what we are being told. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
So you brought in some very sobering realities that many persons have been experiencing, particularly with the gender impact in industries that rely heavily on tourism, the loss of income from a lot of families, and how do they supplement that, and trying to find methods of addressing it as a community and as families as well. We thank you for that response. I now turn to Yenver to give any comments or questions based on what has been presented thus far.
Okay, thank you, Raisa.
You're most welcome.
I'm really enjoying the discussion so far. The question I had would probably take the discussion off on a tangent a bit. I hope that's okay. But for Advent disciples of Sir Arthur Lewis like myself, to hear Dr. Leo here, the second St. Lucian president since Sir Arthur Lewis, that's amazing. And on behalf of some of the young people who I spoke to before coming on this panel, whilst many of us would be inspired by such accomplishments and to see my fellow panelists, all what they've accomplished, all the work they've done. There are also some who would be intimidated as it relates to the level of education. You read Dr. Leo, which means his PhD, and would feel like, that is the only pathway for such success. I wanted to know if Dr. Leo would have any words of advice or encouragement to members of the audience looking in, searching for those words of motivation at the time.
Dr. Leo, what Ian was shared earlier on, because I realized there was some technical difficulty in hearing him, was that for a lot of young people who are watching today's program, myself and other panelists, and even yourself and your own academic achievement may be very intimidating and discouraging for those who may not have followed an academic path and believe that that is the only gateway to achievement. What would you say to them to inspire them to speak to them about their own future and the contribution that they play in the development of their society and their intrinsic value?
Thank you for that. I think we should start straightforward by saying we don't have to have everybody with PhDs. We don't have to have everybody with masters. And we don't have to have everybody with bachelors. But I think there has to be a minimum level of education that everybody should have. Now what I mean by education now is important. I don't necessarily mean school certification, but education as a means to allow you to function in society. And therefore, we have to rethink what our education systems are about. We should be able to provide tiers of learning, tiers of functionality, because it takes all to make a society a society. We cannot have only PhDs doing every type of work there is by definition. And every work is important. Every one is valued. And that's the other thing. There's a mindset issue that the people that are the most valued are the PhDs or the doctors. No, that cannot be correct, because, and if I can be, I don't want to be disparaging, but let me draw it as a contrast. If your garbage collector does not pick up your garbage for 1 week, irrespective of whether you say he needs a bachelor's, a PhD, or whatever to do that, you know what that means. Not only health or inability to live in society. So you cannot even begin to say that that person is any less important than the surgeon that's undertaking neurosurgery at any one point in time. They both have key functions to do. But the requirements of a regular garbage collector, as distinct from the engineer that manages the various sanitary aspects of that garbage, and the doctor now that is supposed to be managing the impact of people who are in non-compliance with regular sanitation issues as a doctor, these are all different functionalities which require different levels and degrees of knowledge. And so my advice to them would be, the people that are learning, see yourself as important in everything that you do, however small. That is the only thing you want to be focused on. See yourself as important. Give it 100%, because it is as important as everything else. The second corollary to that is society in general needs to acknowledge and accept that every role every person plays is equally important. Because it is that is the bigger problem. It's not so much the internalization that I don't have the degree. It is the imposition of society that says we value more, we place a higher degree of acceptance, a higher degree of status to somebody who has a specific field of knowledge or operates in a particular field of industry. And we need to break that down. When you break that down, then you have global acceptance that each part of the whole is important, and the smallest part is as important as the largest part, because any part that's missing, remember where I started this, the ecosystem goes. Any part that is weak, the ecosystem goes. It needs equally strong parts in every aspect to keep an ecosystem together. And so students should see that as a rallying cry for them to choose, be empowered to go with their passion. Everything starts from passion and emotion. And if your passion is in field A, don't be deterred by society wants me to go into field Z, and I need to have a PhD or 6 PhDs to be able to get there. Go with your passion. This is the only thing that can contribute, because that's where your entire soul, your spirit flows into what you do. This is where you generate excellence. Passion generates excellence. Passion gives you the discipline to excel. And passion is what's going to make the difference in the outcome. And that is where I think our sole focus should be. But a large part of the answer, as I said, is our mindset. That
was a very beautiful message and response, that we recognize that there are persons with different intelligences in our societies, but all have a valuable contribution to play. All are equal. But I like the fact that you highlight too that while society has expectations, it's important for the individual to know themselves and know that they have a passion that they should follow. Yanva, thank you so much for that question. Murphyllis, what are your thoughts on the idea that certain persons can achieve and others cannot, particularly from the standpoint of persons with disabilities, and what Dr. Leon would have just said?
Well, Raisa, I am most excited to come in at this particular point, and Dr. Leon laid a very great foundation when he clarified what education, what knowledge acquisition is, what passion, that there are various levels. Now, to your particular question about people being able to achieve and accomplish, I want to use the words of the late, great Dr. Stephen Hawking, who is regarded as one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of the modern era. Dr. Hawking achieved some of his greatest works while he was totally paralyzed and did not even have a physical voice. He was able to speak using technology and move around using technology. And understanding his privileged circumstances, he was an advocate for governments, public and private sectors, investing lots of resources into ensuring that people with disabilities, especially young people, have the necessary tools in order to express their potential, understanding that these tools do cost a lot of money. So here in St. Lucia, a lot of our advocacy has been focused on education, on training, and on the greater employment of our members. Now, the ILO conducted a very interesting study where they indicated that nations forfeit as much as 3 to 7% of their GDP when people with disabilities who are willing and able to work are discriminated against and not incorporated into the workforce. These are large and measurable. So in our advocacy, we promote to governments that it just makes good economic sense. It is good business to train us and to ensure that there are opportunities for employment. Now, this is very interesting in that throughout the Caribbean, we are faced with a situation of the stigma attached to our people that we are mostly objects of charity, waiting around for public assistance payments, who are uneducated, we're totally dependent on others for our daily living. But we know this is not the case. We know that there are politicians, world leaders, professionals with disabilities across all sectors in our economy. So one of the questions that I want to pose to Dr. Leon, especially from his vantage as president of the CDB, we know it has worked in other parts of the world where there is disability quota employment legislation. Certain countries have laws which mandate businesses beyond a certain size to hire a certain percentage of people with disabilities in their workforce. I would love to benefit from his experience with the IMF across various continents. Does he feel such legislation is necessary here, or should we leave it open to the discretion and the goodwill of businesses to hire qualified persons with disabilities? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I enter this on the other side of the logic of the argument that says, if somebody has a disability, is it the disability that is preventing them from working, or is it the perception associated with a disability that prevents them from working? And the two aspects of that has an implication to answering the question which you posed. So if I can just walk down the two, because that will help the answer. On the first part of, is it the disability that prevents them to work, I think we are again trapped in our own mindsets about physical limits. And so we interpret our entire existence as people, as humans, on the basis of limits of our physical structures. And so when we see somebody with a disability, what we immediately think is that physical disability is below the threshold of normal physicality, and therefore that person is not fit for work. Now that says I can change that aspect of it. I cannot change the person's physicality because they are disabled. But if I can liberate my mind that boundaries are not necessarily of a physical form, then I don't have to worry about saying I am not admitting somebody with a disability. That's the first part. The second is, if I were to say now that the limits of physicality are not critical, but what matters is the functionality that is being executed, then as long as the person has the ability to execute, then I don't think we should have a problem. And so from the legal aspect of this, I would say, let me make sure that everybody has the ability of that functionality. And it boils down in the end to where we were a while ago: knowledge, education, to function in society. And if that is there, I don't even bother to need to legislate, because the functionality exists and the barrier of physicality is not relevant because I've changed my mindset. Then I don't have a problem in terms of legislating. But it takes both parts: a change in the mindset and improvement in the functionality through education and function that will allow me to say I don't need legislation. But if I cannot do both of those things, such that firms are now looking at people with disabilities, then I would see legislation as a, I would want to say, temporary means of avoiding discrimination from somebody that has the ability to function, and that is where the legislation side would come in for me. But I would prefer to think of us in a state where we are liberated in our minds and we have given the functionality that there is no need for legislation because it would happen automatically.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that question and for those responses that really highlight the importance of not just legislation but cultural and social transformation that guides our legislative agenda. This has been such a riveting discussion, but unfortunately our 1 hour conversation has come to an end, but we hope that we will have future conversations. But before we wrap up, it's always important to give thanks where thanks is due, and for that purpose I hand over to Ms. Tiana Foster.
Thank you. On behalf of the panelists, the staff and students of the college, and our virtual audience who is listening in with us, we'd like to thank you and your team from the CDB for your time spent with us this morning. It was an insightful and progressive conversation, and I'm sure it was of great value to all who are listening. We'd also like to thank you, Dr. Leon, for continuing to give back to your alma mater, the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, and we'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to return in future for further engagements excuse me, and initiatives that the college will be undertaking. I also wish to thank the other youth panelists for your participation this morning, the organizing committee for ensuring that today's proceedings all ran smoothly, our virtual audience for your attendance, Ted Stanford from Acid Creations for photography, Landmark Limited and All Biz Production for ensuring that we had the best set and virtual space to stream from today. Thank you all. I would also like to remind our virtual audience that you can keep up to date with the various initiatives being undertaken by the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College by following our social media pages, and you can also do this by visiting our website, which is salcc.edu.lc. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to your continued support and participation in future events. Dr. Leon, before we close off, we would like to present you with a token of our appreciation for your time with us today. Thank you.
Presented by
Mrs. George.
Let him sit. Stay seated.
Very nice.
So he's unwrapping his gifts.
There we go. Can the camera sit? Congratulations.
On your appointment, honoring Dr. Hyginus Leon, President, Caribbean Development Bank, May 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Photo op? Is that possible? But ladies, you are mic'd up. We are. Put on your masks, yes? You can take the mics off, because we're not using them again. And we're still live, but we're going to take a picture of Dr. Leon. So this is,
mask on.
yes, we have to. Yes. Ladies, let me take this one. I know, we can take it, yes, you just want to be live. Okay, thank you so much.
Once again, we thank you all for watching, for tuning in to the Future Leaders Forum hosted by the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. It was a pleasure having you, our viewing audience, via the SALCC's Facebook, YouTube pages, as well as the Caribbean Development Bank's pages. We continue to advocate for education and development, and we invite you to be our continued supporters on that mission.